My son had been sitting in county lockup for 11 days when I stopped defending him. I'm not proud of that. I'm 64 years old, and I have made a lot of mistakes in my life, but giving up on my own blood, that one sits with me heavy. It sits with me every single morning when I wake up and every night before I close my eyes. I tell you this now because you need to understand where I was, in my head, in my heart, before any of the rest of this makes sense. My son's name is Daniel. He's 38, and up until 11 days before that courthouse morning, he had been an account manager at a financial consulting firm called Hargrove Capital. He was good at his job. Meticulous, his supervisor used to say. Trustworthy. That word now felt like a bad joke sitting in the back of my throat. He had been arrested on a Thursday. 2 federal agents came to his house at 6 in the morning, and my daughter-in-law called me in a panic while the agents were still walking Daniel out the front door. I drove over in my bathrobe. I stood on the sidewalk watching my son get put into the back of a black sedan, and he looked at me through the window with this expression I could not read. Not shame, not fear, something else. Something that looked almost like an apology. The charges were wire fraud and embezzlement. The prosecutors said Daniel had been siphoning money from client accounts for nearly 2 years. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. The total they put in front of the judge was just under $400,000. My son said he didn't do it. For the first week, I believed him. A man believes his son. That's the basic contract of fatherhood. But then the evidence started coming out in the pre-trial hearings, and it was not small evidence. Bank transfers with Daniel's credentials, emails from Daniel's work account, a secondary account registered under a variation of Daniel's middle name. His own attorney looked at me in the hallway one afternoon and could not quite hold my gaze, and that was when something in me started to crack. My wife, God rest her, she would have never wavered. Eleanor was the kind of woman who believed in our son with her entire chest, no qualifiers, no hesitation. She passed 3 years ago, a heart attack at 61, fast and without warning. Since then, it had been just me, rattling around our house in Cincinnati, going to the grocery store, watching the news, waiting for Daniel to call on Sundays. Now Daniel could not call. Now Daniel was in a cell, and I was driving myself to the courthouse alone, and Eleanor was not there to squeeze my hand in the parking lot. I walked out of the courthouse at about 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. The hearing had not gone well. The judge denied bail reduction. Daniel sat at the defendant's table in a gray suit that looked too big for him now, and he had lost weight, and when they led him back through the side door, he turned and looked at me one more time. I did not know what to do with that look. I was heading toward the parking structure on 4th Street, my head down, moving on autopilot, when someone fell into step beside me. He was younger than Daniel, maybe early 30s, wearing a blue jacket that was slightly too warm for the weather. He had the look of someone who had not been sleeping. He said, quietly, without turning his head toward me, "You're Daniel's father." I said I was. He said, "My name is Marcus. I worked with Daniel for 4 years. I need you to listen to me very carefully." I stopped walking. He kept moving forward 2 steps, then turned around to face me. "What your son is accused of," he said, "he didn't do. Not one transaction, not $1. I can prove it. But you cannot go home right now, and you cannot talk to anyone from Hargrove Capital, and you cannot talk to Daniel's attorney until after you've seen what I have." I stared at him. I told him I did not know who he was, and I did not know why he was approaching me on a public sidewalk, and I had half a mind to walk away. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out a folded piece of paper. I took it. It was a handwritten note. The handwriting was Daniel's. I knew my son's handwriting the way I knew his voice. "Dad, if Marcus found you, go with him. I know what it looks like. I know you have doubts. I saw it on your face. I don't blame you. But please, go with him. There are people who do not want this to come out. Don't go home first. Go to the storage facility on Loveland Avenue, Unit 4. Marcus has the key. Love, Daniel." My hands were not steady. I looked up at Marcus. He was watching me with quiet, careful eyes. He wrote that 2 weeks before he was arrested, Marcus said. He gave it to me and said he hoped he would never need me to use it. That if things went the way he planned, it would never come to this. He paused. Things didn't go the way he planned. I folded the note and put it in my coat pocket. I said, "Tell me what is going on." Marcus glanced around the sidewalk. "Not here. Follow me to Loveland Avenue. I'll explain everything when we get there. I should tell you what went through my mind during that 15-minute drive. I am 64 years old, and I have lived enough life to be a skeptical man. I thought about the possibility that this young man was some kind of con artist, that this was a scheme of some sort, that I was an old widower driving alone toward a storage facility I had never heard of. I thought about calling my daughter-in-law. I thought about pulling over and going home. But I kept hearing Daniel's voice in the words on that paper. I know you have doubts. I saw it on your face. I don't blame you. He had known I was starting to lose faith. And instead of being angry, he had written, "I don't blame you. That was my son. That was the boy I raised." I kept driving. The storage facility on Loveland Avenue was one of those long, low-slung places with orange rolling doors and a gravel lot. Marcus was already there when I pulled in, standing outside Unit 4 with a padlock key in his hand. The unit was not large, maybe 10 by 12 feet. There was a folding table set up in the center with a laptop, a portable printer, and 3 expanding file folders stuffed with paper. Along the wall, stacked in 2 rows, were banker's boxes. I counted 9 of them. Marcus closed the door behind us. Daniel started noticing irregularities about 2.5 years ago, he said. He did not sit down. He stood with his arms crossed like a man delivering a briefing. He was running routine reconciliations on a block of pension accounts, working people, union members, most of them, teachers, sanitation workers, city contractors, about 230 accounts in total. He opened the top file folder and spread several printed spreadsheets on the table. The discrepancies were small at first, fractions of a percent. Easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. But Daniel looked closely because that was how he worked. Marcus looked at me. "You know your son. You know how he is with numbers." I did know. Daniel had always been that way. As a kid, he would balance his allowance to the penny. It used to make Eleanor laugh. He traced the withdrawals back to a pattern of internal transfers. They were being routed through a shell account and then moved offshore. They had been doing it for almost 4 years before Daniel caught the trail. Marcus pointed to a name highlighted in yellow on one of the spreadsheets. The transfers originated from this authorization level. "That's CFO access. That's Richard Hargrove." I looked at the name. Richard Hargrove, the founder's nephew, the man who had been with the firm for 20 years. The man whose photograph was on the company website next to phrases like "steward of client trust" and "decades of integrity." "How much?" I asked. "Total?" "Best estimate from what Daniel was able to document, just over $2 million. Taken from pension accounts belonging to people who cannot afford to lose it." I sat down on a folding chair. My legs felt unreliable. "Daniel didn't go to the authorities immediately," Marcus continued. "He wanted to be certain. He spent 6 months quietly gathering documentation, on his own time. At home. He didn't tell anyone at the firm. He didn't even tell me until he was almost ready. He hesitated. He didn't tell your daughter-in-law either, because he was afraid. Not for himself, for her. For the kids. I thought about my 2 grandchildren, 8 and 5 years old. Hargrove found out Daniel was looking, before Daniel was ready, Marcus said. We don't know exactly how. Somebody talked, or Hargrove had some kind of flag set up on the audit system. But about 3 weeks before Daniel was going to go to the FBI, Hargrove moved first. Marcus opened the laptop. He turned it toward me. On the screen was a series of emails, Daniel's work email on one side, and a secondary account on the other. The secondary account was made to look like Daniel's. Same name, slightly different domain, close enough to fool a cursory glance. Hargrove's people created a ghost account, Marcus said. They used it to send instructions for the fraudulent transfers. To anyone looking at the records later, It appears to be Daniel directing the money. His name, his credentials, transfers that align with times he was logged into the system. He clicked to another screen. What they didn't know was that Daniel had installed a shadow audit log on his own workstation, totally off network, just a small external drive. It captures login timestamps and session metadata. It proves that at the moment those transfer instructions were sent from his so-called account, Daniel's actual workstation was sitting idle and locked. I stared at the screen. "That drive is in this box," Marcus said, picking up a small hard case from the table. "And these folders contain printed documentation of everything Daniel gathered on Hargrove. The original irregularities, the offshore routing, the shell account history, authorization logs, everything." I was quiet for a long time. The orange door hummed slightly in the wind outside. "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" I finally said. 11 days. My son has been in there for 11 days. Why didn't you?" "Because I was scared." Marcus said it simply, without apology. "I have a family too. And when I saw what happened to Daniel, how fast it happened, how completely they set him up, I was scared. I spent the first week trying to figure out if coming forward would get me in the same situation. Or worse." He looked at me steadily. "I'm not brave, sir. I want to be honest with you about that. Daniel is brave. I'm trying to do the right thing now. Late, but doing it." I nodded. I could not be angry at him for being frightened. I had spent 11 days being frightened of my own son. "There is one more thing," Marcus said. He reached into the third file folder and removed a single sheet of paper. He held it out to me. It was a printed email chain. The top email was from Daniel, dated about 3 months ago, addressed to a federal address I did not immediately recognize. The subject line read, "Confidential tip possible pension fraud, Hargrove Capital." Below, it was a reply from someone with a federal email address, acknowledging receipt and asking for a follow-up meeting. Below that was Daniel's response, confirming a meeting date. Below that was a cancellation notice, sent the morning of the meeting date 3 days before Daniel was arrested. The cancellation was sent from Daniel's ghost account. The real Daniel had never canceled. He had shown up to that meeting and found no one there, because Hargrove's people had sent a fake cancellation to the federal contact before Daniel could make his case. My throat tightened. My son had tried to do everything right. He had found evidence of a crime. He had documented it carefully. He had gone to the appropriate authorities, and at every step, someone with more power and more resources had cut him off at the knees. And when the trap finally closed, he had said nothing, not one word in his own defense that would put his family at risk, and had trusted, on nothing but faith, that the truth would eventually surface. He had trusted that I would eventually show up. I put the email chain down on the table and I pressed both hands flat against it and I took a long breath. There was a knock on the rolling door. Marcus and I both turned. He went to the door and opened it a few inches, then opened it fully. There were 2 people standing in the gravel lot. A woman and a man, both in plain clothes, both with federal credentials already in their hands. The woman said her name was Agent Carla Destin, and she said they were with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. She said they had been investigating Hargrove Capital for about 8 months. She said they had been looking for Daniel's shadow drive for weeks because their own case was strong but not airtight, and the metadata on that drive was the last piece they needed to definitively disprove the fabricated transfers. She looked at me. "You're Daniel's father," she said. I said I was. "He told us about you," she said. "When we finally made contact with him through his attorney last week," he said. She paused, and something shifted briefly in her professional composure. "He said he wasn't worried about the legal outcome. He said the only thing he was worried about was you." I did not trust my voice right then. I said nothing. "We're going to need to take this material into federal custody," she said. "And we will be filing a motion to exonerate by end of week. Given what we have and what's on that drive, I don't expect the judge to take long." She held out her hand. I picked up the small hard case with the shadow drive and held it for a moment. This small, unremarkable piece of plastic and metal, this thing my son had the foresight to create, alone, quietly, while the walls were already starting to close in around him. I placed it in her hand. 4 days later, the charges against Daniel were dismissed. I was in the parking lot of the county detention facility at 7:15 in the morning when they processed him out. The September air was cool, and the sky was one of those flat Midwestern whites, the kind that doesn't promise anything in either direction. I had my hands in my coat pockets, and I was watching the door. He came out carrying a paper bag with his belongings. He was thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and 2 weeks of beard. He stopped when he saw me, and we looked at each other across about 30 feet of concrete. I did not know what to say. I am not a man who has ever found words easily, and in that moment I felt 64 years of inadequacy sitting on my chest all at once. I thought about Eleanor, about how she would have been the one running across that parking lot, how she would have handled this reunion with the grace and warmth that she handled everything. I did not have her grace. I only had my 2 feet and my pounding heart and the knowledge of what I had almost done. I walked toward him. When I got close enough, I said his name. Just that. Daniel. He looked at me for another second, and then something in his face came apart a little, and he put his arm around my shoulder, and I put both of mine around him, and we stood there in that parking lot while the morning traffic moved indifferently past on the street behind us. I told him I was sorry. He said, "Dad, you're here." Like that was the whole answer. Like showing up in a parking lot at 7 in the morning was sufficient payment for 11 days of doubt. He had always been more generous than me that way. More like his mother. Later that morning, we sat at my kitchen table with coffee, and I asked him why he hadn't told me what he was doing. Why he had carried it alone for so long. He wrapped both hands around his mug and thought about it. "Because you would have worried," he said. "And there was nothing you could have done. And I didn't want you to spend months carrying something heavy when I didn't know yet if I could actually fix it." He looked out the kitchen window. "Mom always said you took on other people's weight too easily. That you'd carry something for years and never say it was heavy. I didn't want to put that on you." I thought about Eleanor saying that. I could hear her voice saying exactly that, the wry and loving way she used to call out my stubbornness. "You were protecting me," I said. "I was trying to," he said. "I wasn't sure I'd done a very good job of it." I thought about the 11 days, about the moment I stopped defending him, about his face through the courthouse side door. "I failed you," I said. "Somewhere in there. I stopped believing you." He looked at me directly then, and his voice was steady. "You showed up, Dad. In the end, you showed up. That's what I needed." We sat there for a while longer without talking. The coffee cooled. The kitchen was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 3 years, since Eleanor, but it felt different now. Less like an empty room, more like a room between things. I found out later the full scope of what Daniel had been sitting on. 231 pension accounts, working people across Hamilton County and parts of Kentucky. Retirees living on fixed incomes who did not know for 2.5 years that their savings were being slowly drained by a man in a corner office who had steak dinners with city commissioners and gave money to children's hospitals, and smiled in every photograph. Richard Hargrove was indicted 6 days after Daniel was exonerated. Federal prosecutors described the scheme as one of the most methodical and coldly calculated cases of pension fraud they had seen in that district in 15 years. 3 of his associates were indicted alongside him. The morning the indictments were announced, there was a brief item about it on the local news, and then it was gone. Because that is how news works. But for 231 families, it was not gone. It was everything. I called Marcus the week after Daniel got out. I told him thank you. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that Daniel had once stayed late to help him through a performance review that could have cost Marcus his job, and that Daniel had never mentioned it to anyone, had never used it as leverage, had never even brought it up again. He said he had spent 11 days trying to decide if he was brave enough to return that favor. I told him I thought he was braver than he gave himself credit for. I have been thinking about that a lot, about bravery and what it actually looks like. It doesn't always look like charging forward without fear. Sometimes it looks like a 30-year-old man in a blue jacket walking up to a stranger on a courthouse sidewalk with a folded note. Sometimes it looks like a son who says nothing in his own defense for 11 days because staying quiet is the only way to keep the people he loves out of the line of fire. And sometimes, I suppose, it looks like a 64-year-old man who almost got it catastrophically wrong, sitting in a plastic chair in a storage unit on Loveland Avenue, reading a spreadsheet and trying to breathe. I put a photograph on my refrigerator after that. It's the one from Daniel's 40th birthday. His was a few months after the exoneration, and we had a dinner. Nothing large, just family. He's standing next to the cake my daughter-in-law made, and he has his arm around my shoulder, and I look tired in the photo. Honestly, I look every year of my age, but I am smiling the way I have not smiled since Eleanor died. She would have been so proud of him. She also, if I know her, would have given me a very specific look for the 11 days of doubt. That look she had the raised eyebrow, the slight tilt of the head, the absolute silence that somehow communicated an entire paragraph. I probably deserved a long version of that look. But she also would have forgiven me, because that was Eleanor. She believed in second chances. She believed in people showing up late and still being welcomed in. My son believes that too, it turns out. I did not understand everything Daniel was doing while he was doing it. I did not see the long hours he must have spent at his kitchen table after the kids were in bed, cross-referencing numbers by lamplight. I did not see the 6 months of quiet documentation, the careful building of a case, the weight of knowing what he knew, and the loneliness of carrying it. I saw only the surface, the arrest, the charges, the evidence that looked damning from the outside, and I made the oldest and most ordinary mistake a person can make. I judged what I could see instead of trusting what I knew. He never asked me to take that on faith without reason. He left a note. He left a name. He left a key in the hands of a friend and said, "If it comes to that, make sure my father knows." Not the judge, not the press, not the public record. His father. That is what my son thought about, sitting in that cell. Not his reputation, not his freedom. Me. Some people spend their whole lives hoping to be loved that well, and never find out that they already are. The morning I drove to that storage unit on Loveland Avenue, I did not know what I was going to find. I followed a stranger to a nondescript building on a side street, and I rolled up an orange door, and I sat down on a folding chair and read the truth about my son. And the truth was this. He had seen a wrong being done to people who could not protect themselves, and he had decided, alone and without asking permission, to stand in front of it. It cost him everything he had for a season. It cost him weight and sleep and 2 weeks of his life and 11 days of his father's faith. But he stood in front of it, and it fell. If you are sitting somewhere wondering whether the person you love is the person you think they are, I would say this. Look at what they protect. Look at what they do when no one is watching. Look at whether, when things go wrong, their first thought is of themselves or of you. Daniel's first thought was always of someone else. It was his mother's best quality, and he carries it forward, and I did not give him enough credit for it. I do now. Before you walk away from someone you love, before you let doubt tell you the story instead of the evidence of years, make sure you've looked in every room. Make sure you've read every note. Make sure you've driven to the place on the map, even when it makes no sense, even when you're not certain, even when you're 64 years old and tired and driving alone. The truth, in my experience, is usually one unlocked door away.